Hello? Hello! Welcome, everybody. My name is Nathan Albert. I'm the university chaplain on campus and work in the Spiritual Life Center. We are glad you're here. Welcome to the annual Clifton L. Snidow Lecture on Christian Life and Work. It's a long title, but we are glad you're here. A little bit about this lecture. Snidow, the gentleman who this chapel is named after, he was a member actually of the Board of Trustees from 1906 to 1928. And he actually was a key player, not only in starting this lecture series, but a key player in changing the institution. So he was actually one of the gentlemen who changed the name from Virginia Christian College to then at the time they wanted Lynchburg Christian College. And he was adamant that it should be called Lynchburg College to honor that this is a school for all students, and this is a school for all of us in the city of Lynchburg. He helped the institution not only find the resources to build this building, but he also helped the school during a season of financial crisis and transition early on in its founding. So this lectureship started in 1951, so it's 70 years this lecture has been going, and it's always been focused on how one's Christian faith specifically, and this has changed over the years, but how one's faith in particular is influenced or impacts your life, your work, kind of your day in, day out. And over the years, we've seen this evolve, right? So even though it has the title of Christian Life and Work, we've, over the years, expanded this to talk about spirituality in general. In the past, more recently, we've had lectures on humanism and atheism, but some of the, actually have a few of the names of people who've been here before. So in 1951, the first lecture was called "Why Should Anyone Be a Christian This Day?" by Albert, which is my last name, so he's awesome, Albert Day. I don't know if he was famous or not in 1951, but that's who gave the first lecture, so you're following in his footsteps. We've also had Elizabeth Gowdy, Shane Claiborne, John Shelby Sponge, Justin Lee, last year was Walker Bristol, among dozens and dozens of other speakers. So some of the themes that we've had over these 70 years, we have this list in our office, so I was able to go over some of it today. Some of it was centered on Christian education and what does it mean to be educated in this world. Some were focused on how to have the courage to be your full and true self, how to love an enemy, peacemaking during the nuclear age, how to care for creation, how your flaws make you a fuller and better human. And then, as I mentioned, humanism, atheism. 2 years ago, we had a conversation on conflict in the LGBTQ community. So as we were planning this lecture months ago, we knew that we wanted to bring someone to campus to speak on the intersection of mental health and spirituality. We thought that was crucial, and we think that no matter what your faith or secular tradition, that we think you'll appreciate this lecture, and we hope it will impact you as well. This evening, we have the honor of listening to Reverend David Finnegan Hosey. He comes to us from Bon Air Christian Church outside of Richmond, Virginia. But his lecture, which I believe is up on the screen, "You Are Not Alone, Faith, Crisis, and Mental Health." Tomorrow, if you're interested in this, if you've enjoyed this lecture, tomorrow, just as an FYI, at 11:30 in the East Room, you are all invited to join a workshop with David. You can grab lunch through the line or through the cafeteria and join us in the East Room. That lecture is going to be called "Sharing Stories to Change the World." It's a workshop on mental health care, advocacy, and justice. So again, that'll be from 11:30 to about 1 o'clock in the East Room tomorrow. A quick bio on the Reverend David Finnegan Hosey. He's the author of "Christ on the Psych Ward" and "Grace is a Pre-Existing Condition, Faith, Systems, and Mental Health Care." He serves as the co-minister of Bon Air Christian Church, which is the Disciples of Christ, a connection to our campus here as well. He's previously served in a variety of ministry settings, campus ministry, nonprofit, as well as congregational or church settings. He holds an MDiv from Wesley Theological Seminary, a unit of clinical pastoral education. He's also certified by the Mental Health First Aid USA, which provides help for people experiencing depression, anxiety, psychosis, substance abuse disorders. Much of his work and writing centers on the intersection of mental illness and mental health and faith. And if you'd like a copy of any of his books, he has them right over here. And he can share more about that information afterwards. So he'll speak for a bit, and afterwards we'll open it up to a Q&A. So if you have questions, I'll use this microphone, and I'll come around and we can ask questions. And then again, we'll have a time if you want to purchase books afterwards. We'll have time to do that as well. So with that, I'd like you to join me in welcoming our 2021 Snidow lecturer, Reverend David Finnegan-Hosey.
Thank you all so much for being here this evening. Thank you, Nathan, for hosting and the Spiritual Life Office. And I originally got the invitation from Stephanie McLemore, and then like a week later she called me and said, P.S. I'm leaving. And so you've made the transition very smooth and great work. So thanks so much for having me. I want to start, we're going to talk about some tough topics tonight. So just want to start briefly by just like, we're here, right? Here we are. It's a nice, safe chapel. Just kind of, if it's comfortable for you, you can put your feet on the ground, kind of rock from heel to toe. Just feel the ground under your feet, okay? So we're going to cover, some topics that are pretty difficult to talk about, right? So I just want to say you have permission this evening to be gentle with yourself. If you need to ground yourself, if you need to get up and take a walk, these are topics that impact all of us in a variety of different ways, some really acutely personal ways, right? So you have permission to engage this evening in the way that is safe and is grounding and is helpful for you, okay? I want to begin by sharing a little bit of my own story. Before I do that, just a couple things that I think you should know. First, telling that story means talking a little bit about self-harm and about suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts and behaviors. I don't go into any graphic detail or anything, but again, just acutely aware, right, that these are not theoretical topics for folks, right? These are things that impact our lives, sometimes in tragic and painful ways. So I want you to just be aware of that. And again, you have permission to be gentle with yourself. Oh, great, okay. You all feel comfortable with that? Okay. The second thing I want to say is I like to start with some of my story because I found that doing that creates space for others to share difficult or painful experiences. And as well, in the words of the Quaker author and educator Parker Palmer, the story of my journey is no more or less important than anyone else's. It is simply the best source of data I have on a subject where generalizations often fail, but truth may be found in the details. On the other hand, there's some risks in starting with a personal story. For one thing, my story is not some sort of universal story of mental health challenges. Other people have different types of stories to share. In particular, I think it's wise just to name up front that my story, while a painful one at times, is one that also is buffered by many kinds of advantage and privilege that are created by inequitable conditions within our society. So for many folks in this country, racial, economic, and geographic disparities make access to mental health care seem like a distant dream. For many others, mass incarceration, chronic homelessness take the place of any sort of functioning mental health care system. So if you only have me, if you've just got my story, right, you actually don't have all of the voices that we need to have the big, deep, wide conversation that we need to have about mental health care in our country. So I say that to say, I'm hoping that me telling my story is like a conversation starter, right, not a conversation ender. That my voice can join together with your voices and with many other voices in a call for transformation that's much needed in our world. So with that said, I want to tell you a story. It's a story about how I learned from college students how to speak truthfully about mental health struggles. It was the spring semester of 2012, and I just returned from a brief jaunt through hell. I'd made it through my first year of my divinity program at Wesley Seminary in Washington, D.C., and everything had gone well, seemingly. I had good grades, was making new friends, interesting learning, which made it really confusing and scary when I reached the summer of 2011 feeling like inside everything was just coming apart at the seams. And while I was maintaining a sort of facade of normality, even going to summer classes to learn biblical Hebrew, I'd return home to my basement apartment where I found myself spiraling downward and downward and downward into a deep and terrifying darkness. I began to harm myself, something that I'd struggled with in high school but thought I'd kind of left behind me in college. Began engaging in risky behaviors with the secret hope that some fatal harm might come to me. Began searching, in short, for some kind of way to make this internal pain stop. My memories of that time have a surreal quality to them, like I'm watching distorted footage of someone else's life. Finally, some friends began to notice and ask some questions. A call to a suicide prevention lifeline, another call to a friend, led to a series of events, at the end of which, with the help of a few more friends, I admitted myself into the hospital emergency room for the first time in my life. It wasn't the last. I was in Sibley Hospital for about 2 weeks, put on a bunch of medication, felt a bit safer and more stable, left the hospital, and then a few weeks later, I went back in. And then I got out, and then I went back in again, and by that third short-term hospitalization, it was pretty clear that the mental health crisis I was in the midst of required a much more structured environment for healing and recovery than the one I was getting. And so I found myself in a 3-month residential program further from home, where I received a new diagnosis that seemed to make some sense of the pain I was in, type 2 bipolar disorder, for you who into those details. A new regimen of medications, new forms of therapy and support that taught me new skills for managing the nearly deadly emotional storm which had raged internally for, at that point, 6 straight months. And then I came back home to DC, and I was safer, and I was more stable, and I was grateful to be alive, and also, that was all true and good, and also, things were really, really hard for a really, really long time. Now, at the time, I was scheduled to begin my seminary internship with some college students at the university next door. And I'd interviewed and I'd met student leaders. I'd even been able to attend their opening worship service before I landed back in the hospital and then left town for this residential hospital program. So here I'm back home, and I learned that my seminary wanted me to stay on medical leave. I was unsure when I'd be able to resume classes. My days were kind of unstructured. Getting out of bed was pretty hard anyway, especially in the gloom of my basement apartment, so it wasn't obvious what I might be getting out of bed for on any given day. So it came as a blessing to me that this campus ministry and the sponsoring congregation extended me an invitation to begin working with them again in the interim. I wasn't really sure what I would have to offer, me who was struggling just to get upright in the morning, but it was a reason to get out of the dark apartment, and so I leapt at the chance. Okay, so leapt is a bit much. Maybe sort of crawled at the chance would be a better way. So as I said, I'd already met some of these students that I'd be in ministry with, and so I stepped into this new role as the intern, a little bit unsure who knew where I'd been and what had been going on with me. It did feel like I owed some sort of explanation as to why I had shown up in August and then disappeared by September, only to show up again in January. And lying about it all just seemed like it would be, frankly, pretty exhausting. So at our first Thursday night worship service, where I was scheduled to give the sermon, I preached and I talked a little bit about my experiences. I talked about Jesus calling the disciples his friends, and about how lonely the hospital had often felt, and about how God understands our lonely experiences. And I hoped that the students would know I was okay, and they didn't have to worry about me, and then we could get back to it, right? Get back to the work of ministry that we were supposed to be doing together. But that wasn't what happened. What happened instead is that students started coming to me one at a time and saying things like, I struggle with anxiety and depression, or I've got a family member who has a serious mental health challenge, and it's really hard for them and for us, or I've got a friend who's going through a really hard time right now, and we're not even sure what to call it, and we don't know how to help them, and I didn't know that we could talk about it in church. But now you have, so now I know we can. And that's how college students began the long and steady process of teaching me how to tell the truth about mental health and mental illness and faith. When I look back at that time now, it seems to me like I stumbled into story. Stumbled into discovering the power of story and the power of creating space for others to share their own stories. Stories they had previously, for one reason or another, not been sure they were allowed to share. Now, look, if I had the chance, there's probably some things I would have done differently. It was probably a risky move telling that story so soon. I've learned much since then about what it's healthy for me to share and not share, about the care I take with language, about being sure I spent some time processing difficult experiences before bringing them into a sermon with me. But in all its imperfection and messiness, those first stuttering attempts to share some of my story of mental health challenges with my students opened the doorway for conversations, real conversations, about the hard stuff that we all deal with. Hard stuff we're increasingly aware that college students deal with regularly. The data on mental health challenges in the college years is there for the viewing. A recent report from the American College Health Association reveals that in 2018, more than 80% of college students have felt overwhelmed by all they had to do. More than 50% experienced feelings of hopelessness. Perhaps even more telling, more than 40% of college students reported feeling so depressed that functioning was difficult. And more than 10% of students shared they had seriously considered suicide during the past year. More than 10%. There are plenty of explanations advanced, both popularly and in academic research, for this challenging landscape. From theories of societal anxiety growing up in post-9/11 world, deeply impacted by the financial crisis of 2008, and now, of course, the COVID pandemic. The acknowledgement that efforts to challenge stigma around mental illness will inevitably mean higher rates of reporting, positive hidden within a seeming negative, to increased expectations on students linked to increasing college costs. So all of those are possible explanations. I think I left out for my tech team back there, I think I have a slide, the next slide here with those statistics, just so folks can see them. Thanks. So there's plenty of explanations out there, right? Of course, college has always been a time of transition, and it's one in which the support networks and life rhythms you're used to from high school disappear and change. And that can be particularly challenging because the high school and college years are also when certain types of mood disorders tend to manifest themselves, so that the shift in support systems comes just at the same time as the emergence, potentially, of a new mental health challenge. And let's face it, like, school can just be stressful, right? For some students used to excelling in high school, college can be more academically challenging than you're used to, and for others, the academic environment fails to live up to the high expectations you've placed on it. Now, I want to acknowledge, right, college can also be a really exciting and deeply meaningful time. It's a time for exploring who you are, what you're passionate about, how you understand the world. It's a time for learning that the you are becoming is loved by God, and discovering the type of communities and activities that help form you into the person God created you to be. But those exciting and meaningful aspects of college can bring up their own challenges to mental and emotional health. Exploring our identities can be scary, especially if we discover parts of ourselves that we had previously buried or silenced or kept hidden from parents or authority figures. exploring our beliefs, our sexuality, our ability to make decisions, and then figuring out where that fits in with where and who we've come from is tough stuff to navigate. It's tough for me. I'm 36. It was tough for me at 18. It's okay if it's tough for you. Also, sometimes the gap between the experience college is supposed to be and the experience we're actually having can be difficult. I've spoken to many students who've told me that they feel like they should be having a great time, making tons of new friends, and learning so much about themselves and the world, and instead are feeling this strange mix of under and overwhelmed, which in turn comes with feelings of guilt or shame. Like, why am I not supposed to be feeling what I'm supposed to be feeling? Why am I not having the amazing experience other people are having and that I'm supposed to be having? So that's why it's really important for us to have places to share honestly about the actual experience that we're having, the good and the bad, the struggle and the celebration. It's important to have space for stories, not just numbers and theories. After all, I'm guessing if you're here tonight, you might not actually need to know the numbers to know that college can be as tough as it can be exciting. And I'm guessing, too, that if you're here tonight, you may be less interested in a sort of debate about the theory behind why the college mental health crisis exists, and are maybe more interested in how to make it through or to help friends or students make it through. A reality that's far from theoretical and is, in fact, sitting leadenly on your dorm room floor. So if that's the case, let's take a little risk and let's stumble into story together, into honest storytelling about the mental health challenges that college can present, yes, but also into new stories, healing stories, that perhaps can offer some hope, or at least some touch points to steady us through the stumble. There's a brief vignette in the 6th chapter of Mark's Gospel that I'd like to read you. It's just 3 verses from the 30th to the 32nd. It goes like this: The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Now, I've forgotten at this point who first pointed out to me that this really short verse in Mark's Gospel says the apostles told Jesus all they had done and taught. If you read this verse aloud with different tones, because the Bible doesn't have stage directions, right? So you read it with different tones, and it seems to mean different things. Like maybe the disciples got together with Jesus and tried to outdo each other with tales of heroic acts of faith and demon exorcising successes and miraculous healing, which would kind of seem to fit with an earlier verse that says they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many were sick and cured them. But maybe they were more honest. Maybe they talked about their failures and their shortcomings. This would seem to fit with previous verses as well, with this little vignette following as it does the story of Jesus totally bombing in his own hometown, and then calling the disciples at a time when Jesus' mission was not off to a great start, immediately followed by the gruesome execution of John the Baptist, a friend and ally of the movement. Imagine with me for a moment this gathering of Jesus' apostles, those who in John's gospel Jesus will call his friends, sharing all, literally all, that they've done and taught and experienced. There are stories of triumph, yeah, but also of struggles and shortcomings and fear. Perhaps the disciples begin as our gatherings with friends sometimes do, joking around with each other and sharing funny stories or humble brags, and then someone, maybe quietly at first, has the courage to speak up and share a difficult story, a story of defeat or of pain, and then another, and then another. Here's the earliest community of Jesus followers gathered around a shared meal to tell stories. Stories about all they were doing and experiencing and succeeding and failing at. If that's not church, I'm not sure what is. It should be noted, by the way, this verse is immediately followed by the story of a big free dinner, so keep that in mind too. So what would it mean for faith in college, or anywhere else for that matter, to look a lot like this early gathering of Jesus followers, sharing stories of the good and bad of our lives together, learning together in conversation with each other? I like to start here in talking about mental health in college because in its seeming simplicity, this version of church as story-sharing space gets at the thing behind the thing. College can be tough. Life can be tough. And inadvertently, faith communities have often communicated to young people in particular that they aren't supposed to talk about that here. I've lost track of how many students have told me some version of that. I wasn't sure we could talk about it. So it's really powerful to be able to say, yes, we can talk about it, and more than that, in talking about it with each other, we discover ourselves and each other as loved and accepted by each other, and loved and accepted by God. If we can facilitate this kind of story-sharing space, we are well on our way to breaking the silence and challenging the stigma which prevents many people with mental health challenges from seeking the help they need. Now, it doesn't necessarily take an expert to create a community of story sharing. It does take some understanding of what makes a safe space for stories to be shared. It takes a willingness to learn, to model and to respect other people's vulnerabilities. Sometimes it takes someone who's willing to go first with a story. And it takes some healthy boundaries and balance between sharing and maintaining healthy privacy, between being in it together and also being our own unique selves. It takes, in other words, a lot of the same things that it takes to be a good friend. In my past ministry as a college chaplain, it was often the case that I would hear about a student struggling with mental health, not because they would come talk to me about it, but because a friend or a roommate would. And many times this would happen close to the end of a semester or an academic year when things were getting stressful for everyone, and a student who'd been supporting a friend realized they weren't sure whether they could keep it up. And they'd often have questions about how they could help. And I'd often tell them that sometimes the best thing you can do to help is to realize that you can't do it all on your own. See, we've learned two wrong lessons when it comes to mental health and mental health struggles, and those two lessons reinforce and exacerbate each other. Wrong lesson number one, both for those struggling and those who are trying to help, is I'm supposed to be able to handle things on my own. I'm supposed to be able to do this by myself. And wrong lesson number two is I'm not supposed to talk about this. So I'm supposed to do it on my own. I'm not supposed to talk about it. So a person who's having a hard time maybe confides in one other person, a roommate or a best friend, and swears that person to secrecy, and they're both thinking that the goal is to try to get through this tough thing without asking for help or telling anyone else about it. Now, please don't hear me saying that you shouldn't be a friend to people having a hard time. Being a good friend is a holy and sacred responsibility. Again, in John's gospel, Jesus calls the disciples his friends. He says, I'm not calling you servants any longer. You know too much about me. I'm calling you my friends. We're not supposed to be able to handle things all on our own, including friendship. And we can find safe and courageous spaces to talk about tough things. It takes all of us to care for all of us. So part of what it means to be a good friend, especially to somebody who's going through a difficult time with their mental health, is to know what your own limits and your boundaries are, and to help expand the circle of care around that friend so that they are not isolated in that struggle. Sometimes that might mean saying, look, I care about you so much. I am really worried about you. I don't know if I'm able to give you the help and support that you need. Can we talk to somebody else together about this? Sometimes it means awkward conversations, being able to ask really direct questions about difficult topics like suicide. Because contrary to popular belief, asking someone whether they've thought about suicide won't plant the idea in their head or increase the chances they'll be hurt or die. In fact, it increases the chances that they'll reach out for help. And there's some great trainings, mental health first aid, and other forms of suicide prevention that are ways to learn about how to do this well. Sometimes having good boundaries in friendship might mean walking with your friend to a chaplain or a counselor so they don't have to do a difficult and scary thing alone. Maybe it means somebody in your campus community going first, sharing their tough story so that others know it's okay to reach out and ask for help. Sometimes it just means learning to show up and listen, that we don't necessarily have the power to fix or change things. The point is we can't do it on our own. I'll say it again. It takes all of us to care for all of us. That oft-quoted idea that God doesn't give a person more than they can handle, that's just not true. For one thing, that's not actually what the verse in 1 Corinthians 10:13 says or is about. Like Paul's writing to the Corinthian church to warn about idol worship. He's not even talking about suffering in that passage. For another thing, Paul's letters to the Corinthians are written to whole communities that are meant to share in each other's burdens and help each other through difficult times. Real quick exercise for remembering this. Anytime you're reading through one of Paul's letters, take the yous and replace them with y'alls and all y'alls, and you'll get the point. He's always saying all y'all, the community, right? And for a third thing, Bible verses should never be used as weapons against people who are hurting, as if the point of Scripture is to kick people while they're down. Our faith is designed to mutually lift us up, which is a point made exactly by Paul in another letter to the Corinthian church, when he writes of a God who consoles us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to console those who are in any affliction with the consolation with which we ourselves are consoled by God. Paul puts that statement about God specifically in the context of his own suffering, which he writes have sometimes been more than he can handle on his own. He says, "We don't want you to be unaware, friends, of the affliction we experienced. We were so utterly, unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we'd receive the sentence of death so that we would rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. God who rescued us from so deadly a peril will continue to rescue us. On God we have set our hope that God will rescue us again, so you also join in helping us by your prayers, so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessing granted us through the prayers of many." In other words, Paul is telling about a time he was suffering so much, he wondered whether life was even worth it. And while he thanks God for his rescue from that time, he also makes sure to share that the support and the love of a community was a necessary component of his survival. In referencing the prayers of the church here, I'm not meaning to insinuate that mental health struggles can simply be prayed away as if challenges and suffering are the result of a lack of faith. Prayer in this passage is a sharing in the consolation offered by God to those who are afflicted. So it's an intentional extension of compassion, a mindful opening of the community's heart to the one who is hurting. Paul's problems aren't fixed by prayer. Rather, in the midst of his suffering, he's upheld by the prayers of the community. Paul couldn't get through this time of affliction alone. Neither can any of us. You are not alone in this. By stumbling into honest storytelling with each other, we find not only shared stories of challenges, but also stories of healing and hope. That's true in part because communities of faith facilitate and reinforce the sort of activities and responses that experts recommend in responding to communal mental health crises. So, for example, modern techniques of mindfulness and grounding, often taught as recognition and coping skills for folks like me who've had to learn to live with oversized emotions, have their basis in the deep wisdom of spiritual practices passed down by faith communities throughout the centuries. Supportive connections with community helps reduce the isolation which can often cause and be the effect of mental health challenges. A supportive community can help its members identify early on signs of distress or unhealth and promote healthy activities. And by challenging the narrative that each person is in it alone, communities of faith on college campuses can help students get past the stigma, shame, and fear that may be associated with having to ask for help. But ultimately, it's more than like a set of behaviors or techniques or practices. It's also true that we can stumble into stories of healing and hope together because the simple act of sharing our stories creates the conditions for a deep solidarity. Exactly the sort of solidarity which God expresses with humanity in the person of Jesus. Exactly the sort of solidarity that the church is meant to express with the hurts and hopes of God's world. So imagine with me, just one more time, those early disciples gathered around a fire with Jesus, telling stories of success and failure, doubt and conviction, stories, in other words, of faith. Jesus, according to Mark's gospel, invites the disciples to come away with him, to rest and to have a meal together. But the sharing of stories and retreat from the busyness and stress of their lives does not lead them to separate themselves from the world. Rather, it ends up creating an opportunity for yet another form of radical ministry and welcome. Because in the very next story, Jesus, with the help of the shared resources of the crowd, feeds thousands of people, showing the disciples how there's plenty of food, and plenty of rest, and plenty of community to go around. So a gathering of friends for an honest accounting of life and ministry together becomes an opportunity to show God's love to the world. That's the kind of faith community I believe can exist on college campuses and elsewhere. Communities organized around God's radical solidarity with the world and the humanity of Jesus. Communities that celebrate with each other and mourn with each other and have honest conversations about it all. And communities that then go out into the world to learn, to grow, to feed, to serve. And even when we mess up, the very act of sharing honestly about those mess-ups and mishaps becomes in turn another instance of stumbling into story together. So look for this kind of community, and if you're there already, help others find it. And if it doesn't exist, help create it. And if you're not sure how to do that, reach out for help from a campus minister or a chaplain or a friend, because you don't have to do this on your own. Whether this is finding a community, or whether this is facing a day or a week or a year that right now seems hopeless or scary. Remember, you are not alone. You are not alone. You are not alone.
We have plenty of time for questions or comments, so we're going to open it up. If you just want to raise your hand, I'll run by and give the microphone, but we'll have a handful of questions. I hope that's okay. We'll grill you, put you in the hot seat, and we'll go from there. So any questions? I can start if people don't have one. Hands? David, I would love for you to, can you share a little bit about your books and kind of the topics? Because I know one in particular really does speak to your story that you somewhat shared in the beginning. So I'd love if you could just share an overview of those.
Sure. Sure. So Christ on the Psych Ward is a book about theology and ministry from the perspective of mental health crisis. It includes a lot of things that I wrote while I was in the hospital. The second book, Grace is a Pre-Existing Condition. If you're particularly interested in some of the barriers to mental health care and the ways that those barriers play out in systemic issues and kind of policy issues, then Grace is a Pre-Existing Condition. Faith systems in mental health care is a kind of a faith perspective on approaching those conversations around how do we heal a broken healthcare system. I just briefly tell you that that book came out in February 2020, which A, is a really bad time to try to launch a book, as it turns out, and B, made some of my analysis of there are some things wrong with the healthcare system look really quaint about a month later, right? But if you're interested in those conversations, that's a place to start. And then there's two other books up here that aren't just by me. I have things in them, but they're by a bunch of different people. One is called Belovedness, and Belovedness, Finding God and Self on Campus. So that's particularly if you're interested in exploring questions of faith on campus. And there's all sorts of great entries in that book from a lot of different campus ministers from a lot of different backgrounds. And then the last one is an interfaith book of prayers and blessings for healthcare workers that I've got a couple prayers in. So, yeah.
Thanks.
David, I just have a comment about about you saying that God does give us more than we can handle, or that comment that people always say, "Oh, God won't give you more than you can handle," and that's just not accurate at all. Life gives us more than we can handle alone. So I really like having you say that publicly, because that needs to be taken out of the English language to be able to not allow folks to say that to others who are hurting.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's really interesting, actually, the context of where that verse that gets kind of pulled out and slightly misquoted a lot is in Paul's letter to Corinth is really interesting, because what he's actually talking about, the conflict that's going on in the Corinthian church, which is this like early church in the city of Corinth, and they're a mess. They're like, it's not going great, okay? And there's all these conflicts going on, and the one he's addressing when he says this thing is this conflict over basically like, are we allowed to have dinner with our pagan neighbors? Like and what Paul is saying is like, yeah, it's okay, like you can encounter differences, like it won't kill you. So it's actually this really fascinating verse about like it's really okay to exist in a pluralistic society, which is not the kind of thought that like we tend to stereotypically associate with Paul, I'll just say. So it's like great context, but it has A, nothing to do with suffering. It doesn't use the term suffering. It's about temptation. And B, like just in in all of his letters, it's really important to know what the context is. And on the other hand, there's all of these places where Paul is like, look, I got beaten up, I got kicked down, I got spit out, I thought I was going to die, right? I mean, Paul is like really incredibly vulnerable about pain and suffering. So the idea that we take a verse out of Paul to be like, buck up, kiddo, is just like, it's so kind of against the grain of what he's writing again and again and again. So, I'll rescue Paul a little bit from some of what's been done in his name. So.
Sure. I was wondering if you could share some thoughts about community on a smaller college campus. One good thing that I see is sometimes, of course, the students see more familiar faces and they connect better on a smaller college campus. But occasionally feedback I've gotten from students is if they don't feel they're fitting in, it's even harder because it's so small, it's kind of even more apparent that, oh, I'm not fitting into this small place. So what would you suggest? On the one hand, the community can be better in a smaller campus, but for those not finding a place, I think it can be even more difficult than on a larger campus.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. I think a couple things that come to mind, and there's no, I don't mean to try to wave a magic wand or anything, but one thing that I've found is really helpful is just like normalizing things. There's a lot of popular conceptions of what college looks like, right? Like things that kind of float around in our culture and in movies and on TV, right? And one of the things that I found is really helpful is just normalizing that, like, look, a lot of people have this struggle, right? Like, leaving a community you knew and coming to a different community is hard, and it's hard to find your place, and sometimes it takes a long time and is frustrating. My wife and I served for a while as chaplains in residence at Georgetown University, so we lived in a 400-person freshman dorm for 3 years right after we got married, which was something. And it was so interesting because particularly around October, right, we'd start getting a steady stream of students who were coming to us and saying, everybody else is going out and partying and having a great time and I'm not. And like the first student who told us that, we were like, that sounds really hard. And by like the 12th student, we were like, it can't possibly be accurate that everybody else is going out and having a great time because at least 12 people have come to us and said that they're not, right? And so I think part of it is normalizing. Part of it is that fit and college campuses is a real thing, and sometimes students come to a place and figure out that this isn't really the right place to be for me. And now that I don't work on college and don't have to worry about retention, I can say, that's great, you should go somewhere else, right? That's okay. So I think that's part of it too, is saying, like searching for the fit. But yeah, it's tough. Finding community as an adult becomes tough. And I'm not going to launch here into any sort of apologetics for the church, because God knows we've got like plenty of stuff to atone for. But like, one of the things that is lost when membership in a faith community becomes less of a default in our society, there's some things that are gained, by the way, which we can talk about separately, but one of the things that's lost is people's access to a sort of community that is there to exist as a community. Now, I'm not saying that church is the only thing that does that, or that faith communities of any sort of religion are the only thing that does that, right? But there is an intentionality to creating community that is taught by faith spaces, at least healthy faith spaces, that I think is important. So if those spaces, if that's not the right space for someone, what is that other right space where you can find those connections and find that support and where people share with honesty with each other, right? It doesn't have to be church. It doesn't have to be faith. But what is it? Where is that? Looking for those communities. I hope that offers a couple things.
I've been kind of on the fence a lot about my faith because when I was in church and I was struggling with my mental health really bad and I was borderline suicidal and stuff, kind of my church turned its back on me, and that was kind of hard. So it's kind of refreshing to hear this, and kind of gives me a little bit of hope that I can come back and find my place here. So it's relieving that we're getting better at least, and that we're trying to support people in the mental health community. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You are definitely not alone in having had that experience. I think that there are a lot of faith communities, a lot of churches that either haven't developed the equipment, right? They haven't developed the skills necessary to support people who are going through mental health challenges, or they've like flat out created some sort of theological structures and system that's actually like made them kind of hostile, right? And that can be really painful, right? It's like just when you need this community the most, right? So thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important for people who are in faith communities to be doing the work to learn how to support folks. Because the thing is, what's like really interesting, right, is like I give talks in churches a lot, right? And I'll come to a church and I'll talk about my story. And like 10 people will be like, yeah, I've been in the hospital, or I've had this like really dark time in my life. But like they've never like told each other about it, right? I mean, it was like it took me coming in and being like, I have bipolar disorder, for like the church to be like, oh, yeah, this is the thing that we deal with. So there's been so much silence and so much stigma, and it's why I'm really passionate about breaking that. But it hurts people, right? It causes real harm, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that. So, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your story and for working to destigmatize mental health problems. What have you seen in the time since 2012 and now, anything that you can put your finger on that has happened societally, or anything that you can name that has worked to move the transparency of mental health issues along? And second question, I guess, since I'll just grab the microphone, is what is the connection between that transparency and the strength of sharing stories and seeking help and resilience? And how can those of us on college campuses work to nurture both of those things? So 2 questions.
Yeah. I think a lot has changed since 2012. I hope in a little tiny bit of a way, right, that I maybe like me telling my story and other people kind of telling their stories has been a part of that. Before I wrote Christ on the Psych Ward, the first time I kind of talked about this publicly, like to strangers, was at a festival that happens in Western North Carolina. And it was me and one other person sharing some stories. And the festival had been going on for 5 or 10 years now then, and we were the first people to speak directly about mental health at this kind of big sort of, yeah, at Wild Goose, yeah. And it was me and Sarah Griffith Lund, and I thought maybe like 10 people would show up, and about 100 people showed up, which is wild, because there's like it's like a Renaissance festival meets a Christian festival. There's like all sorts of stuff happening, right? So a whole bunch of people showed up. And at the end, we had people just kind of get into 3s and 4s and talk to each other. And I circled back around like an hour and a half later, and there were still some people who had like moved out of the tent in their 3s and 4s talking. There was such all I'm saying is like, there was such a need, right? Like people desperately wanted to talk about this, and like wanted to keep talking about it, like not listening to me, right? Talk about it with each other and like offering support. And since then, like each year that I've gone back, there's been more and more like different people offering programs and support and things like that. They've added 12-step groups now. This is just like one example, right? So I've just seen this progression where I think people are getting more comfortable talking about it. I think we're successfully breaking down the silence. The challenge now, as that work continues, right, and this is acutely felt on college campuses, right, is that as people get more comfortable coming forward, need for support goes up. And like the need for support is like this, and our like resourcing is like this, right? So that's creating a new challenge that I think we're now addressing. But that wasn't the challenge 20 years ago, right? The challenge 20 years ago was nobody wanted to talk about it. So that's a big deal, right? That's a big deal. So there's progress being made. I think there's a lot of hope in that. In terms of resiliency, I'll give like my take on this, and it's not the only one, and I think like multiple voices are needed in the conversation. But I do think that resiliency, as it gets framed in sort of U.S. 21st century culture, tends to be individualistic resilience. That's sort of like our primary way of thinking about that. And what I want to kind of do is say like, resilience comes from a community of people who are able to support each other, right? Like that none of us is, like, the American ideal is the individual out on the frontier who's individually resilient, right? Like, I can take on the world. But that's like mainly nonsense, right? And that like, it's actually by creating communities that support each other and ask for help and are able to be in that creative interplay with each other that we really achieve something that looks like resilience. So I always, whenever there's a conversation about resilience, I do always want to kind of like push at the conversation a little bit to like, when we say resilient, what do we mean? Do we mean one person who's able to just overcome every single obstacle in their path, or do we mean creating the kind of community that has the strength to face things together? And like, man, we've had a walloping set of lessons over the past year and a half about the need for communities to be able to be resilient together, right? And our need for each other and getting through things. So that's, I'll say at the very least, as like a pastor and somebody who comes at this from the faith perspective, that's the voice I want to lend to that conversation about shared resilience and shared support.
And some of our faculty have mentioned your book several times, so it's really interesting to get to hear you speak. And I was just curious if there's maybe an anecdote or an interaction that you had with a healthcare provider, maybe during that time or later, that kind of stuck out to you as you were kind of going through what you were going through.
Yeah, sure. I'll tell you a funny one, and then and then one that stuck with me in a really like a helpful interpretive way. So the first time I'd been in a car accident, so I'd been in the hospital once before, but like never like this, right? So I'm in the ER at Sibley in DC, and it took me 8 hours to get a bed to open up in the unit. So I was on the ER for 8 hours. That, by the way, like it felt like forever, but like I was in DC where there's a lot of psych beds, right? I've spoken in communities where people were like, cool story about it taking you 8 hours to get a bed. There's not a psychiatric bed for 50 miles around us, right? So like when we talk about the disparities, right, they're real. So I'm in the unit for 8 hours. I finally get up onto the unit, and the nurse who did my intake had clearly been doing this for a long time. And so there's a bevy of questions they have to ask you, right? And at this point, I'd been asked this set of questions 6 times, right? I mean, so it's like, do you think you might hurt yourself, right? And I was like, yes, that is in fact why I'm here, right? And then the follow-up question has to be like, do you think you might hurt anyone else, right? So, which I didn't think I would hurt anyone, but the week before that, our Verizon internet had gone out, and I'd spent the whole week on the phone trying to get it fixed, which maybe contributed to me ending up in the hospital. And so she looked at me, and I'm exhausted, and I've been at this for 8 hours, and she's probably exhausted. It's probably the end of her shift. And she said, do you think you might want to hurt anyone else? And I said, I kind of want to murder Verizon customer service. And she's writing on her notepad, and she put the pen down, and she looked at me, and she said, honey, that just don't count. And then she went back to like the question. So that was like a brief moment of levity in the middle of the thing. The second story I'll tell you is I had a psychiatrist up at Silver Hill, which was the place I was at for a longer time, which again, like in terms of disparities, like there are just a whole lot of people in this country who couldn't afford to be for 3 months for all sorts of reasons, right? And I had been diagnosed with like a bunch of different things, right, over the course of 6 months. Like, you're kind of like on a dartboard, right? And they're like, let's try this, and he said, he's looking at my chart and he says, I think you have bipolar disorder. And I was just kind of like, what? Like, can you, like, what? And he said, okay, let's stop. He said, here's the deal. Diagnoses are stories. And I was like, and he said, you're telling me a story, and then I've got this thing over here. That's my, the DSM. That's not my diagnostic guide. And we're just trying to match like my story and your story up. And the only thing that matters there is that leads you to healing, right? That gets you to healing. So don't freak out about like what we're doing here. We're sharing stories. And that clicked for me because I'm a story guy, right? That's kind of my currency, right? And so hearing that and hearing that framing of like both like the importance of my story in this process, but also that like the diagnosis itself, it's like it's telling a kind of story, that has allowed me to relate to this thing called bipolar disorder in, I think, a more healthy way than I would have otherwise, and for it to be kind of helpful. Because sometimes like diagnoses can be scary, they can feel like kind of these restrictive boxes, right? So that gave me a lot more freedom to kind of engage with it. And I'll say just like kind of one more thing about that. This isn't really about your question, but you kind of like got me here. So the DSM is the thing that's used to diagnose mental illness, right? And I have type 2 bipolar disorder, rapid cycling with mixed states and diurnal variation. Right? That's like my official diagnosis, right? Which is like handy sometimes, right? But it doesn't actually kind of like, when I'm going through a crisis, I'm not like, oh, it feels like I have bipolar type 2 disorder with rapid cycling, mixed states, and diurnal variation, right? So one of the things that I think I'm grateful for my faith tradition for is that it actually gives a much more visceral experiential language than the language of the clinical healthcare system that we have. This has been helpful for me, right? The clinical healthcare system has done some important things for me. I'm grateful for it. But let me just read real quick. This is just the beginning of Psalm 102. And it says, "Hear my prayer, O Lord. Let my cry come to you. Do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress. Incline your ear to me. Answer me speedily in the day when I call. For my days pass away like smoke, and my bones burn like a furnace. My heart is stricken and withered like grass. I am too wasted to eat my bread. Because of my loud groaning, my bones cling to my skin. I'm like an owl of the wilderness, like a little owl of the waste places. I lie awake, I'm like a lonely bird on the housetop. All day long, my enemies taunt me. Those who deride me use my name for a curse. I eat ashes like bread. I mingle tears with my drink. Because of your indignation and anger, you've lifted me up. You've thrown me aside. My days are like an evening shadow. I wither away like grass." So, on the one hand, I don't think psychiatrists should use Psalm 102 to diagnose people, right? But on the other hand, that's what it feels like, right? That's what it feels like for me to be in a kind of manic depressed mixed state, right? So what that psychiatrist did was he gave me the clinical language and also gave me the space to be like, but this is my story, right? This is what it feels like. So I think that was really important for me. And to the extent that clinical mental health care and community resources can work together to kind of create space for people to be able to own their stories within the process, I think that's really important. Yeah, thanks.
Well, oh yeah. This might be our last question of the evening.
Hey, thank you so much for your words of wisdom and your insight. You spoke about how your faith aided this process of healing for you. Was it ever a thought or anything that your faith hindered this process of healing? I know a lot of people can understand mental health and say I just got to pray harder. I just need to be and in the end, the faith becomes a hindrance into healing of mental health. Was that ever something that you struggled with? How would you advise someone who is struggling with the clashing of faith and true mental health healing as well?
Yeah, it's a great question, thanks. So I think I had a little benefit in this question, right? In that when I was hospitalized, I was in seminary, right? So I was already sort of wrestling with some of the things of what makes for kind of a healthy faith, right? So I think I had some resources there that not everybody necessarily has. So I'll say a couple things. One is for folks, if you're coming from a background where kind of what you've been taught or what you think is to get through a mental health crisis, I just need to have more faith or I need to pray. I think kind of a gentle way of bringing some other resources into that is part of having faith is reaching out for the healing, right? And there's actually all sorts of stories in the Gospels where people reach out for Jesus, right? They're like, hey, right? So having faith doesn't mean turning in, right? I just have to have more faith, or pray harder, try harder. Having faith is a reaching out kind of thing, right? So we expand that circle of faith, right? From you've got faith, so reach out. Let's do this together, right? Probably the way that I had to grapple a little bit, and I think it's probably related, was I think something that my faith taught me is to care about other people. And it was pretty hard for me to think about being in the hospital. I was, in the hospital on and off for 6 months and having to focus on me, like in my healing, and really wanting to help other people and having doctors say, like, you really got to focus on yourself right now. And I think the thing that really helped me with that, and this is actually probably a good story to end on. There's this story kind of towards the end of Mark's gospel. And they're going in this big, like, kind of train up from Jericho, which is real low, up to Jerusalem. So they're climbing a big hill. And there's this guy just sitting on the side of the road, just yelling. And like it says he's like, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. He's just like yelling, like making a scene. And his friends are all trying to shut him up. They're like, shut up. Like, be polite, We're in church, And he's just yelling. And it says Jesus stopped suddenly, which is a really funny image, like Mark doesn't get into, but like they're climbing up a hill, so Jesus like stops, and you can just imagine like the disciples are all like, whoa, like, and then Jesus calls the guy, and it says calls, and then his friends hear it, and they call him, it says calls again, and they said, get up, you got to go, he's calling you, and it says call a third time. It says Jesus calls him, then his friends call him, and they say, get up, he's calling you. And the guy, his name's Bartimaeus, he goes to Jesus, and Jesus is like, what do you want? And he's like, I want to be healed. And Jesus is like, okay, you're healed. And then, at the end of the story, they keep going up to Jerusalem, and Bartimaeus is like, cool, okay, I'm going with these guys, right? Okay, so that's like the story. Okay. So, I'm not saying I didn't experience some, like a miraculous healing, right? But that story is a call story. It's about Bartimaeus getting called. And what he's getting called to do isn't to go help someone else, not at first at least. It isn't to follow Jesus. He ends up doing that, but that's not what he gets called to do. What he gets called to do is just get healed, right? Like that's when Bartimaeus responds to his call in life, right then at that moment in life, it's to experience health and wholeness and healing, right? So that for me was a story that was like, oh, like I had thought a lot about calling, right? I was in seminary. I'm like, I have a vocation. What if I can't do it? What if I can't finish seminary? What if I can't get ordained? What if I can't? Like right now, my calling is to experience health, right? Right now, my calling is to experience healing. The thing that God is calling me to, vocation, before it can be about anything else, it's got to be about me getting healed. And once you see that in that story, you see again and again in the Gospels, when Jesus calls people to him, the healing happens first, right? And then there's the journey with Jesus. So for me, that's been a helpful framing for me as I consider, like, this feels selfish, right, to kind of focus on myself, but it's not, because it's about responding to the call that ultimately is about all of our health and wholeness and healing. So, yeah.
Well, can we thank David again for his expertise?
Thank you all. Thanks for coming out on a Monday night.
I know. I just want to say on behalf of the Spiritual Life Center and the University of Lynchburg, I was reminded as you were speaking of another author I know who talks about giving the gift of being second and the courage it takes to be the voice, like you're saying, to break down the barrier. So I just, on behalf of our campus community, thank you for being the one who's giving others the gift of going second, and that you are the courageous one, so others can see courage in someone else so that they can share their story as well. So thank you for that. Any of you who want to stick around to talk to David as well as pick up one of his books or all of them, if finances are difficult for you to pick up a book and you feel like, I would really like to get a book, come talk to me. We will make sure you get a copy of any or all of his books. But thank you for joining us tonight, and with that, we bid you adieu. So thanks.